Welcome back, artists. Today I'm tackling one of my most frequently asked questions: how to create an accurate oil painting without any kind of pencil drawing underneath. Whether you're an experienced artist who feels overly reliant on an underdrawing, or you're a beginner who wants to learn right from the get-go how to paint in a direct or alla prima approach, this video will help you to streamline your process and give you the confidence you need to paint more loosely. As I walk you through these steps, if you find this tutorial helpful and you want more of this kind of help to reach your big painting goals or in your painting practice, I would love to work with you. For more information on working together, check out the link in the description below. All right, let's get started. First things first, we need to make sure that we are choosing our reference images with care and intention. Whether you're painting a master copy like I am here, or you're painting from your own photograph, or you're painting from life, we want to be really intentional with our setup so that we can make it easier to practice the skills of an accurate block-in, and that we can practice them easily, kind of like having training wheels for right now. The goal here is to find an image that already looks like the kind of painting you want to be able to paint, so you don't choose an image where you would have to change the pose or the lighting or the background. Stick with something that you could just copy for now, while you build up confidence blocking in your paintings without using the pencil. In my case, I'm working off of a Sargent portrait as my reference. I often recommend master copy for this specific exercise for a couple of reasons. One, you know the painting was already organized around a block-in, so you can trust that you too will be able to find a block-in for yourself. 2, the values have already been intentionally simplified or compressed in some way. And 3, you have a guide as to where you can simplify your brushwork. Now, I know values and brushwork aren't the stated goal for this exercise. We're just focusing on the block-in here. But I find it easiest to focus on your block-in method when you aren't worried about color. And if you can study your favorite artist's brushwork in the process in kind of a passive way, hey, all the better. You can do this exercise from a photograph as well, but for right now, as you move away from being reliant on a grid or a pencil underdrawing, I find that staying away from working from a 3D reference, aka working from life, just helps to keep things simple. So just to recap, master copy is usually my go-to recommendation here. Photographs can work too, but for now, I would probably recommend against working from life until you get really confident in this process and you don't feel that you need the pencil anymore here. So now that I have my reference picked out, I'm going to go ahead and put it in grayscale since I'm focusing on value for this video. And then I'm going to crop my reference to match the exact proportions of my canvas. This step is crucial for maintaining the correct scale throughout your painting and making it so much easier to measure and check the accuracy of your proportions. The next step is to set up your digital screen, or if you prefer traditional methods, print off your reference and place it next to your easel. Make sure the reference image is lined up perfectly with your canvas so it's really easy to compare the two. In my case, I decided to get a photo print of my reference and physically tape it up next to my canvas, again, making sure they were lined up perfectly. I didn't do anything special to get the print. I just printed off my reference image at Walgreens and taped it up on a board right next to my canvas. Now that I have the reference image and the canvas set up, the next step is to visualize the negative space around the subject. You can use a measuring tool or you can use plumb lines if you're working site size to accurately gauge the angles and the space around the subject, but in my case, I chose to do this freehand. So I'm not using any measuring tools or a proportional divider here, but you absolutely can use this for yourself at this stage. That being said, if these are tools that you're not already familiar with, you don't need to be familiar with them to use this process. So if you're looking for an opportunity to use these tools and you are familiar with them, go ahead. But if you aren't or you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry. From here, I begin by blocking in large diagonal brushstrokes that divide typically the positive and the negative space. I could also do this by light and shadow though. So to begin this painting, I'm going to start by thinking about the subject versus the background, but you'll see as I progress onward, once I have the subject background border established, I actually switch to thinking in terms of light versus dark. This helps me to ensure that I'm keeping in mind the overall symmetry and form of the head by thinking about the subject first. And once I have that firmly established, I can switch into light versus dark so I can start losing edges and compressing my values the way Sargent did in his painting. Now, to find these diagonals in question, look for big intersections and simple shapes. Sometimes my initial lines that separate the subject from the background or my lights from my darks take the form of diagonals that literally cut the corners of my canvas. Something like this. But in this painting, I noticed that the diagonals that gave me the most information were actually fairly straight up and down. So I chose to visualize this painting like this. To lay in these large diagonals, I'm using a synthetic flat brush that has a neat, thin tip, so my brush strokes are reasonably tidy and easy to read. I'm also thinning my paint, which is just ivory black at this stage, with a little bit of Gamsol that it flows smoothly over the canvas. To aid in this process, I often really like to compare exactly where the intersections are of my major diagonals with the outer borders of the canvas. So I've represented what I'm talking about in green here. If any of the shapes created by these diagonals don't seem to match from your reference to your canvas, or the intersections just don't seem to line up from the reference to the painting, well, that's how you know you need to make an adjustment. This can easily be facilitated by simply taking a step back, literally. So literally back up 8 to 10 feet and compare your block in to your reference. Backing up helps you to take in the really big picture, so being able to tell if at a glance things are working. You can also squint to blur the details and ensure the overall impression aligns with your reference. For this painting, I realized it would be much easier to determine whether the overall impression was correct by actually massing in some darks, since the Sargent painting I'm studying here has a black background. So I went ahead and carefully but simply laid in darks where I was pretty sure they would go based on these exact diagonals that we've been talking about. To do this, you would first mix up the average value of your overall darks in your painting. In my case, because this painting is so dark, when I actually put my loaded brush over top of the reference image, I realized that ivory black was a match for this painting's background. And the painting's background happens to be the most common dark value in the painting. So I decided to stick to ivory black straight out of the tube. That being said, this was definitely an exception, not the rule. Most paintings' average dark value is much more of a mid-tone, so you'll save yourself a lot of time and effort by laying down the big average dark value versus just going with black. But for me on this painting to lay down this dark tone, I did this by thinning my paint with Gamsol once again, but in this case I did it just a little bit less, so with a little bit less Gamsol than I did to lay down the initial line work, so that the painting wouldn't be quite as transparent as it was when I was putting down those large diagonals. I want just enough Gamsol so that the paint feels wet and flows evenly, but still maintains its opacity. From here, I would repeat the last couple of steps of stepping back and squinting, or even better, doing it throughout this process to ensure that the overall impression and big shape relationships feel correct. I'd start with really big, crude shapes, and then over time, as I am more and more confident, start to whittle those shapes down. The objective here isn't ever to get into really tiny, fussy shapes, but simply to get to the point where rather than looking like I have a big quadrilateral of light in the middle of this dark painting, instead, it should look like I am actually painting a face. But as you go through this process, to really check your work and make sure that everything is working, you can use a tool like Photoshop to overlay your block in thus far over top of your reference to see if it's accurate. Because your reference image in your canvas should be the exact same size or aspect ratio, you should be able to easily just find the corners of each one when you're looking at them digitally and drag them onto one another until the borders of your reference and the borders of your painting match up perfectly. From there, what you would do is set your painting layer to about 60% opacity, just enough so that you can see both your reference and your painting at once, like I have here. If you'd like a step-by-step breakdown of exactly how I do this in detail, I have an entire video dedicated to this specific Photoshop trick, which I will link in the upper right-hand corner. Once you've done this though, take a look at your overlay and note any discrepancies. Then adjust only what's necessary, using existing brush marks as guides for new, more accurate brush marks. Again, at this stage, you are just sticking with your dark paint, and it should be one flat layer. We're not trying to render or go into detail or have any variation as far as our values are concerned. And I typically repeat this process of stepping back, squinting, making adjustments, and then using Photoshop to check my work until I see that the block-in is totally accurate, while still keeping to just one dark value plus the white of the canvas and sticking to big shapes. But what if you accidentally went too far with your dark values? This is when it makes sense to go ahead and mass in your overall light value. Now, I like to stick with just 2 values for block-ins because it really forces me to decide what counts as light versus what counts as dark, versus kind of taking the easy way out by just adding more value. Not only does this overcomplicate your painting and make it more likely that you'll be overworking it down the road, it also deprives you of the opportunity to really make difficult decisions that make you a stronger painter. I talk about the specific benefits of this in depth in my video interview with Devin Corwin, and later when I talk about the benefit of no-tan studies on my YouTube channel. So if you want to learn more about the reasoning and benefits behind sticking with 2 values, check out the links to those 2 videos in the upper right-hand corner. But for now, just know that I'm going to paint only with 2 values, one dark and one light. And for anything that appears in the middle, I need to decide and commit to where those values will go, either in the light or in the dark. And for those light values, go ahead and mix up your big average light value versus just sticking with white. It helps you later on in your painting process to be already as close to the final product as you can get in this block-in stage. So you'll see here that I go ahead and mix up a single mixture that I'm going to use as a placeholder for all of my light values, and then go ahead and fill in the areas of blank canvas. And I use this as an opportunity to push back any dark areas that may have overflowed from where they were supposed to be. One important thing that I want to note about this is that I am not working any of my paint into other paint at this stage. So what I mean by that is I'm not blending or creating soft edges, but rather I'm keeping my edges between light and dark as hard and crisp and clean as I can. The benefit of this is that you're really keeping to your 2 value structure and again forcing yourself to visualize how the painting would work if you only had 2 values to work within, rather than having a bunch of little gradations that let you sort of bypass the effort of deciding exactly where the light ends and the dark begins. So resist the temptation to blend at this stage because you will become a better painter for it. The act of making that tough decision as far as where exactly the dark ends and the light begins, that is a skill that really builds up over time, and it might seem tedious right now, but it will benefit you in the long run. If you do find yourself needing to shift the borders between where your light and dark shapes meet, I find it's helpful to start with diagonals and shapes where you have the most confidence that you can make an adjustment totally accurately. For me, that usually means using the boundaries of my canvas to my advantage. So I will often work from shapes that meet the outside edge of the canvas first and get those shapes as accurate as I can before moving in to the center of the canvas where maybe I have less objectively accurate anchor points. Then, as those kind of outer shapes or those more easy to see shapes are looking really solid and accurate based on things like backing up and squinting or using Photoshop, I can go from there to venture into areas where I am less confident. Now, to help keep these divisions really clean, because I know it's easy to accidentally get a muddy blended edge between your lights and your darks, I find it's helpful to first use something like a synthetic flat brush for this. They often have a really tidy, neat edge to the brush stroke and are just easier to predict and control. Then make sure that you have enough paint on your brush. So if you are finding yourself pressing kind of hard onto the canvas to deposit your paint, you probably need more paint, and you may also need a little bit of medium at this stage in order to help your paint flow more easily from your brush onto the surface. The more lightly the paint will come off of the brush and onto the surface, the harder of an edge or the more clean of an edge you're going to be able to get. Often that blended kind of muddy edge comes from pressing the brush too heavily into the paint surface. Another tip for ensuring this kind of crisp, clean look is to deposit your paint by laying your brush on its side versus having the brush perpendicular to the painting surface. Now, this doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. You can see in my painting that it's not perfect. I have some places where my edge is a little bit softer, or my paint got a little bit mixed together, and I do have technically more than 2 values here, but I'm trying to keep as strongly to those hard edges and just 2 values as much as I possibly can. From here, I repeat these checking steps where you back up and squint or use Photoshop until it actually has a likeness and it's starting to look like the painting in question, at least in terms of the big shapes. And as far as the block-in is concerned, that's it. You've blocked in a portrait with no underdrawing. In next week's video, I'll talk about how this sets you up to avoid the dreaded messy middle stage of a painting, where things tend to get muddy, chalky, or just plain overworked. So don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss it. Until then, happy painting.